Hello and welcome aboard to the Snoozy Voyager. Imagine a legendary island civilization. A place of impossible technology, concentric rings of water and land, gleaming temples, and philosophers so advanced they made Socrates look like he was still figuring out how fire works. A society that supposedly sank beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day and night, taking all its secrets with it. By all logic, this place never existed. It was a story, a metaphor, a philosophical thought experiment cooked up by one chatty Greek philosopher who may have just been trying to make a point about hubris. And yet, for over 2,000 years, explorers, mystics, conspiracy theorists, and very serious academics have dedicated their entire lives to finding it. Entire television specials have been made, diving expeditions funded, crackpot theories published, all searching for a city that was probably never real in the first place. This is the story of Atlantis. So how did a fictional island from an ancient dialogue become the most famous lost civilization in history? How did a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial ambition transform into a global obsession? Why do we keep looking for it in every sunken ruin from the Bahamas to Antarctica? Tonight, we will explore the original story as Plato told it. We will follow the trail of seekers, frauds, and dreamers who claim to have found it. We will dive into the real ancient catastrophes that might have inspired the myth. This is a story of impossible geology and wishful thinking. It is also a story about humanity's eternal need to believe that somewhere, somehow, there was once a paradise, and that maybe, just maybe, we can find it again. But before we set sail into the realm of the improbable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of mysterious islands, dubious geography, and the eternal human habit of believing that the past was way cooler than it actually was. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Athens around 360 BC. You're attending one of Plato's philosophical salons, and the old man has just started telling a truly wild story. He claims his great-grandfather heard from a very reliable source. It involves a massive island empire, angry gods, and a civilization that makes Athens look like a provincial backwater. You're supposed to be learning about the ideal forms of government, but instead you're getting what sounds suspiciously like ancient fan fiction about a supercontinent that conveniently disappeared without a trace. The funny thing is, Plato seems completely serious about this. Picture the scene. You're sitting in a sunlit courtyard somewhere in Athens. The air smells of olive oil and Mediterranean heat. Plato, now in his 60s, is surrounded by his students and various wealthy Athenians who have nothing better to do than listen to philosophy all afternoon. This is the ancient Greek equivalent of a TED Talk, except it lasts for hours and there's no coffee. The great philosopher has already spent years writing about ideal forms of government, the nature of reality, and whether the physical world is just a shadow of some higher realm. He's established himself as one of the most important thinkers in human history, and now he's telling you about a magical island that sank into the ocean. The story comes in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, named after the characters who tell the tale. Critias is supposedly recounting a story passed down through his family from the great Athenian lawmaker Solon. Solon, the story goes, travelled to Egypt around 600 BC, which actually happened. While there, he spoke with priests who had access to records far older than anything in Greece. These priests, apparently impressed by this visiting Greek, decided to share with him the story of a great war that took place 9,000 years earlier. 9,000 years. That would place these events around 9500 BC, which is approximately the time when humans were figuring out that planting seeds made food grow in predictable locations. The priest told Solon, who told Dropides, who told Critias the Elder, who told Critias the Younger, who is now telling Plato and his dinner guests about this incredible lost civilization. It's like that game of telephone you played as a child, except it spans 4 generations and involves the entire history of Western civilization. At each step, details could have been added, removed, embellished, or completely fabricated. It's the least reliable source chain imaginable for something people would later spend 2,000 years searching for, but here's what makes it fascinating. Plato presents this story not as obvious mythology, like the tales of Zeus and his various romantic escapades, but as ancient history. He's framing it as real events that actually happened, passed down through reputable sources. He's giving it the veneer of historical documentation. Whether he believed it himself or was engaged in some elaborate philosophical role-play is a question scholars have debated for centuries. His student Aristotle apparently thought it was obvious fiction, but something about the way Plato told it, with specific details and that authoritative chain of sources, made it feel real enough that people are still arguing about it today. Think about that for a moment. You're sitting in that courtyard, and this respected philosopher is describing a civilization with technology and organization that seems impossible for the time period he's describing. He's talking about massive engineering projects, organized military forces, and a level of political sophistication that took actual human civilizations thousands of years to develop, and he's claiming it all existed nearly 10,000 years ago and then vanished completely. It's either the most important historical revelation ever, or it's the most elaborate setup for a philosophical point about hubris and moral decay. Spoiler alert, it's probably the second one. But we're only just getting started. Let's start with what Plato actually claimed about Atlantis, and it's important to note that he mentioned it in exactly 2 dialogues, and then apparently forgot about it entirely, which is not typically how you treat a major historical discovery. According to his story, Atlantis was a massive island located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, in the vast Atlantic Ocean. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which even by ancient geography standards is absurdly huge. The island was arranged in perfect concentric circles of land and water, like someone designed a city using only a compass, and an obsession with symmetry. It's the kind of detail that screams I made this up rather than I'm recalling historical facts, but we're only just getting started. The geographical description alone should have been the first clue that something was off. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules was, to the ancient Greeks, essentially the edge of the known world. It was the point where the familiar Mediterranean ended, and the vast, terrifying, largely unexplored Atlantic Ocean began. Saying something was out there was roughly equivalent to saying it was in another dimension. It was the ancient equivalent of claiming something exists in a parallel universe. Convenient, untestable, and impossible to disprove. Now let's talk about the size. Plato claimed Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia combined. In ancient Greek geography, Libya meant North Africa, and Asia meant what we'd call Asia Minor or the Near East. So he's claiming this island was bigger than 2 continents. That's not an island. That's a landmass on the scale of Australia or Antarctica. For reference, the largest actual island on Earth, Greenland, is about 2 million square kilometres. The Atlantic Ocean is certainly big enough to theoretically hide something that size, but there's a small problem. We've mapped the ocean floor. We have satellites, sonar, and submarines. If there were a continent-sized landmass that had sunk in the Atlantic within the time frame of human civilization, we would know. The geological evidence would be overwhelming and impossible to miss. Then there's the famous description of the city's structure. Plato describes it as a series of concentric rings, alternating between land and water. Specifically, there were 3 rings of water and 2 of land, all perfectly circular, surrounding a central island. On this central island was a hill, and on that hill was the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. The rings of water served as harbours and defensive barriers. Bridges connected the rings, and a great canal cut through the rings from the sea to the centre, allowing ships to sail right into the heart of the city. It's an elegant design. It's also geometrically perfect in a way that natural geography never is. Rivers meander. Coastlines have irregular shapes. Even the most carefully planned ancient cities had to work with the actual terrain. But Atlantis is described as though someone drew it with a compass and ruler, creating a diagram rather than describing a real place. It's the kind of perfection you see in Renaissance paintings of ideal cities, not in actual urban archaeology. Real cities are messy. They evolve over time. They have irregular streets and awkward corners where builders had to work around a hill or a marsh or someone's grandfather's house that couldn't be moved. The dimensions Plato provides are equally suspicious in their precision. The outer ring of water was said to be 3 stadia wide. The ring of land next to it was 2 stadia. The next ring of water, 2 stadia, and so on, with each element proportioned according to a neat mathematical system. A stadium was a Greek unit of measurement, roughly 185 metres. So we're talking about rings hundreds of metres wide, arranged in perfect geometric harmony. It's beautiful as an intellectual exercise. It's also exactly what you'd design if you were creating an allegory about a perfect society rather than describing a real place where people actually had to live and work and deal with things like sewage and storms. Here's the thing about perfect geometric cities. Humans have tried to build them throughout history. The Romans loved their grid systems. Renaissance urban planners drew elaborate circular and star-shaped ideal cities. Modernist architects in the 20th century designed geometric utopias. And every single time, reality intervenes. The terrain doesn't cooperate. The city grows in unexpected directions. People make unofficial paths. Practical needs override aesthetic perfection. The fact that Atlantis is described as achieving this geometric ideal perfectly is not evidence of advanced engineering. It's evidence of a thought experiment. It's a diagram in a philosophy lecture, not a historical report. But good luck convincing anyone searching for underwater ruins of that. The story begins with the gods dividing up the world amongst themselves like cosmic property developers, and Atlantis fell to Poseidon, god of the sea, which is convenient given that the whole place was about to become very wet. Poseidon fell in love with a mortal woman named Plato, and being a god with boundary issues and unlimited power over water, he decided to protect her by carving her hill into those famous concentric rings, alternating water and land. He then proceeded to have 10 sons with her, because ancient gods apparently didn't understand moderation. The eldest son, Atlas, became the first king, and the island was named after him. It's all very neat and mythological, which should have been the first clue that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a historical documentary. According to Plato's account, after the gods finished dividing the earth among themselves, each deity received their portion by lot. Poseidon got the island of Atlantis, which at the time was inhabited by primitive people, including a man named Evenor and his wife Leucippe. They had a daughter, Clito, who caught Poseidon's eye after her parents died. Now, Greek gods noticing attractive mortals rarely ended well for anyone involved. But in this case, Poseidon apparently decided to settle down and play house, at least by divine standards. To protect Clito and keep her isolated on her hill, Poseidon used his powers to create those concentric rings of water and land. He literally reshaped the geography using god powers, which is a level of civil engineering that makes the Panama Canal look like a child's sandcastle. The ring served as both a palace and a fortress. The central island where Clito lived became unreachable without a boat surrounded by alternating rings of sea and land that served as natural defences. It's the ancient equivalent of a very elaborate moat system, except created by divine intervention rather than thousands of workers with shovels. Then came the children. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 sets of twin boys, 10 sons in total. The eldest was named Atlas, and he became the first king of the island and gave it his name. His twin brother was named Gadeirus, and he received the eastern portion of the island. The other 8 brothers also received portions of the realm to rule. These 10 brothers became the founding kings of Atlantis, and their descendants would rule the island empire for generations. It's a neat origin story that explains both the island's name and its political structure. It's also completely mythological in structure, following the standard pattern of divine ancestry that every ancient civilization claimed. The interesting thing about this origin myth is how it parallels other foundation legends from Greek tradition. Gods falling in love with mortals and having heroic children who become the ancestors of great civilizations is basically the entire Greek mythological playbook. Perseus, Hercules, Achilles, they all had divine parents. Claiming divine ancestry was how you established legitimacy in the ancient world. It's how you explained why your family deserved to rule. Every royal house in Greece could trace its lineage back to some god or another, usually through a complicated family tree that required a chart to understand. But here's what's fascinating. If Plato wanted people to believe Atlantis was a real historical civilization, starting with a literal god creating the island through magic is a strange choice. It's not how you establish historical credibility. It's how you signal that you're telling a myth. Compare this to how Herodotus or Thucydides, actual Greek historians, wrote about real places and peoples. They might mention what the locals believed about their divine ancestry, but they reported it as belief, not fact. They described real geography, real political structures, real wars with real casualties and real consequences. Plato, on the other hand, has Poseidon personally terraforming an island with magic powers to create the perfect concentric ring city. He has a god literally carving circular channels through solid rock with divine power. It's the mythological equivalent of saying, and then a wizard did it. The fact that this doesn't immediately disqualify the entire story from being historical to modern Atlantis hunters is honestly baffling. But perhaps the divine origin story is so embedded in Greek tradition that readers simply accepted it as the standard opening formula and focused on the later details about the civilization itself. Either way, we've established that Atlantis was supposedly founded by a god with relationship boundary issues and an architectural obsession with circles. Everything that follows is somehow supposed to be taken more seriously. Good luck with that. According to Plato, Atlantis was blessed with such absurd natural wealth that it makes Saudi Arabia look financially modest. The island supposedly produced 2 harvests per year, had mountains full of precious metals, and possessed something called orichalcum, a mysterious metal that was second only to gold in value, and which conveniently has never been found anywhere else because it probably didn't exist. They had hot and cold springs, which sounds lovely until you remember that describing a place with both hot and cold water is basically describing anywhere with basic plumbing. The Atlanteans built magnificent temples covered in silver, gold, and the mysterious orichalcum, and they constructed a massive canal system that would make modern engineers weep. It's prosperity, porn for ancient philosophers. The agricultural bounty of Atlantis deserves special attention because it defies both logic and climate science. Plato claims the island produced 2 full harvests per year, which is technically possible in some tropical regions with careful crop selection and irrigation, but certainly not with the grain crops ancient civilizations depended on. Wheat and barley, the staples of Mediterranean agriculture, require specific growing seasons. You can't just plant them twice and expect twice the food. It's not how farming works. But Atlantis apparently had perfect soil, perfect climate, and perfect everything, producing abundant harvests with apparently no effort, no droughts, no crop failures, and no agricultural challenges whatsoever. The island was also blessed with abundant natural resources. There were vast forests providing timber for construction and shipbuilding. The mountains contained every type of metal, including copper, tin, iron, silver, and gold. This is already stretching credibility. Most ancient civilizations had to trade extensively for metals, because having every type of valuable ore in one location is geologically unlikely. Different metals form under different conditions. But Atlantis had everything, because of course it did. Then there's orichalcum, the mysterious metal that appears in exactly one place in all of classical literature, Plato's description of Atlantis. He describes it as second only to gold in value, and says it was mined from the earth in many parts of the island. The walls of the royal palace were covered with it, and it was used extensively in decoration alongside gold and silver. The problem is that nobody has any idea what orichalcum actually was. Various scholars have suggested it might have been brass, bronze, amber, or some alloy that's been lost to history. The most likely explanation is that Plato simply invented it as another marker of Atlantis' impossible wealth. It's the ancient equivalent of unobtainium from science fiction films, a miracle substance that exists to make your fictional civilization seem more advanced and mysterious. The infrastructure of Atlantis was equally impossible. Plato describes a massive canal that was cut straight through the concentric rings, 50 stadia long, which is about 9 kilometers. This canal was 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep, large enough for the biggest ships to sail through. It connected the outer ocean to the central harbour, allowing maritime trade to reach the very heart of the city. This is the kind of engineering project that would be challenging with modern equipment. The ancient Greeks had to dig canals by hand, using thousands of workers and years of labour for projects far smaller than this. The plain beyond the city was irrigated by an elaborate network of canals that collected water from the mountains and distributed it across the farmland. The whole system was geometrically organised with perfectly straight canals running in grids. It's described like a modern irrigation scheme, with the precision and planning of 20th century civil engineering applied to a Stone Age civilization. Again, it's technically possible, but the level of organisation, mathematical precision, and labour coordination required would be extraordinary for any ancient society, let alone one that supposedly predated written language. And then there were the buildings. The royal palace and the temple of Poseidon were covered with precious metals. The temple interior had a ceiling of ivory, and the walls were decorated with silver and gold and orichalcum. There was a massive statue of Poseidon riding a chariot pulled by winged horses, so tall it touched the ceiling. Outside were golden statues of all the original kings and their wives. It was excessive even by the standards of ancient religion, which regularly featured gold-covered temples and massive cult statues. But this was excess piled on top of excess. A civilization so wealthy it could literally plate its buildings in precious metals, like a Bronze Age version of a Dubai hotel. Here's the thing about resources and wealth in the ancient world. They came from somewhere. Mines had to be dug, forests had to be cut, metals had to be smelted, food had to be grown, harvested and stored. Each of these processes required enormous amounts of labour, technical knowledge, and social organisation. Atlantis is described as having all of this in abundance, effortlessly, producing 2 harvests a year and mining every valuable metal with apparently no difficulty. It's not the description of a real economy. It's a wish fulfillment fantasy. It's what you'd design if you wanted to imagine a civilization with unlimited resources and no constraints, which is exactly what Plato was doing. He was imagining a perfect state with perfect conditions so he could explore, What happens when that perfection corrupts? But we're apparently supposed to believe this was real. The Atlanteans weren't just wealthy merchants sitting around counting their orichalcum. They were a massive military power with an organised and terrifying army. Plato claims they could field over 1 million soldiers, which for ancient logistics is approximately as realistic as claiming they had nuclear submarines. They had 1,200 warships, which is more than most ancient empires could dream of maintaining. Their military organisation was suspiciously detailed for a place that supposedly vanished 9,000 years before Plato's time, almost as if someone was inventing an idealised military structure for philosophical purposes. The Atlantean Empire had supposedly conquered parts of Europe and Africa up to Egypt, controlling vast territories across the Mediterranean. They were the ancient world's hypothetical supervillain. Let's talk numbers, because the military statistics Plato provides for Atlantis are where the story really goes off the rails into pure fantasy. He describes an army organised into units based on a decimal system, with the island divided into 10 regions corresponding to the 10 original kings. Each region was required to provide a specific number of troops. The total military force, when fully mobilised, consisted of 10,000 chariots, 1,200 warships, and over 1 million infantry and cavalry combined. These are numbers that would make Alexander the Great jealous, and he actually conquered most of the known world with far fewer soldiers. To put this in perspective, one of the largest armies in the ancient world was the Persian force that invaded Greece in 480 BC. Herodotus, who had a tendency to exaggerate, claimed it was over 2 million men, but modern historians estimate it was probably around 200,000, including support personnel. Even the Romans, at the height of their power, maintained a standing army of around 400,000 legionaries spread across the entire empire. The idea that a single island civilization in the Stone Age could field 1 million soldiers is logistically absurd. Feeding an army of that size would require a supply chain and agricultural surplus that took actual civilizations millennia to develop. A soldier needs roughly 3,000 calories per day, more when marching or fighting. An army of 1 million men would require 3 billion calories per day, every day, just to stay alive and functional. That's not counting the horses for cavalry, the animals pulling the chariots, or the supply personnel. The amount of grain, meat, water and fodder required would be staggering. Ancient logistics were brutal. Armies starved regularly. Supply lines determined the outcomes of wars. The idea that Atlantis could casually maintain a 1 million-man standing army suggests either magical food production or complete ignorance of how ancient warfare actually worked. Then there's the navy. 1,200 warships is an enormous fleet. For comparison, Athens at the height of its naval power during the Peloponnesian War had around 300 triremes, and maintaining even that many nearly bankrupted the city. A trireme required about 200 rowers plus marines and officers. It needed constant maintenance because wooden ships left in water rot quickly. The timber requirements alone for building 1,200 warships would deforest a small country. And you need skilled shipwrights, rope makers, sail makers, bronze workers for fittings, and a massive infrastructure of naval yards and arsenals. The organisation Plato describes is also suspiciously sophisticated. The military was divided into standardised units with specific troop requirements from each district. There were heavy infantry, light infantry, cavalry, charioteers, and specialised troops for naval operations. The command structure was hierarchical and well organised. This is the military organisation of a Roman legion or a modern army, not a Bronze Age civilization. Early warfare was much more chaotic, with armies that were often militia levies, tribal confederations, or retinues of warriors following individual leaders. The standardized bureaucratic military machine Plato describes took thousands of years of trial and error to develop. And then there's the empire itself. According to Plato, Atlantis didn't just have this massive military for defense. They used it to conquer vast territories. They controlled parts of Libya as far as Egypt and parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which is roughly modern-day Italy. They were building an empire, subjugating other peoples, and presumably administering these conquered territories. This requires not just military might, but political infrastructure. Governors, tax collectors, garrisons, communication networks, and the bureaucratic machinery to hold an empire together. Rome spent centuries developing this system. Atlantis apparently had it all figured out in the Stone Age. The purpose of describing all this military might is clear from the context of Plato's dialogue. He needs Atlantis to be a formidable threat so that Athens' victory over them is meaningful. The more impossible the odds, the more impressive Athens becomes for defeating them. It's narrative logic, not historical fact. He's building up the antagonist to make the protagonist look better. It's a storytelling technique as old as storytelling itself. The problem is that centuries later, people read these military statistics and tried to take them literally, as though Plato had been consulting actual war records rather than making up numbers that sounded impressive for his philosophical point about hubris and divine punishment. But here's where Plato's moral philosophy kicks in, because this wasn't just a fun story about a cool advanced civilization. It was a parable about hubris and moral decay, and like all good Greek tragedies, it ends badly for everyone involved. According to the tale, the early Atlanteans were virtuous, noble, and despised wealth, which is a hilarious thing to say about people literally living on an island made of precious metals. Over generations, however, their divine nature became diluted, and they grew proud, greedy, and morally corrupt. They decided their massive empire wasn't massive enough and set their sights on conquering Athens and the rest of Greece. This was their big mistake, because attacking the philosophical centre of the universe in a story written by an Athenian philosopher tends not to end well. The moral arc of Atlantis is the entire point of Plato's story, and it's worth paying attention to because it's the reason he wrote it. He describes how the original Atlanteans, those 10 brothers descended from Poseidon, were inherently noble and virtuous. They possessed a portion of divine nature from their godly ancestor. This made them wise, gentle, and focused on virtue rather than wealth. Despite living on an island overflowing with gold and precious resources, they supposedly regarded these things with contempt, treating wealth as a burden rather than a treasure. It's the ancient Greek philosophical ideal, the virtuous person who is above material concerns. For many generations, this divine nature remained strong in the Atlantean kings. They obeyed the laws established by their ancestor Poseidon. They ruled justly. They maintained friendly relations with other states. They were everything an ideal civilization should be. It's worth noting that this is exactly the kind of golden age that philosophers love to imagine, a time when people were better, purer, and more virtuous than the corrupted present. Every culture has some version of this myth, a lost age when humanity lived in harmony. Plato was giving Atlantis its golden age so he could demonstrate what happens when it ends. But as time passed and generations succeeded one another, the divine nature within the Atlanteans became increasingly diluted. This is a clever bit of mythological genetics. The further removed from their divine ancestor they became, the more their human nature dominated, and human nature, in the Greek philosophical view, was prone to corruption. The proportion of divinity to mortality decreased with each generation, and as it decreased, so did their virtue. They began to care more about wealth. They became ambitious. They grew proud of their power. They started to value the wrong things. This moral decay manifested in specific ways. They began to engage in aggressive expansion, conquering their neighbours not for defence but for glory and greed. They accumulated more wealth than they needed. They became focused on luxury and display. Their foreign policy shifted from cooperation to domination. They stopped following the laws of Poseidon and began making decisions based on ambition and desire. To any student of Greek philosophy, these are all the classic signs of corruption. They're the opposite of the virtues Plato spent his career advocating for: temperance, justice, wisdom, and courage. The final step in their moral decline was the decision to attack Athens and attempt to conquer the entire Mediterranean region. This was the ultimate act of hubris, the kind of overreaching ambition that inevitably invites divine punishment in Greek thought. They already had everything. They controlled vast territories. They possessed unlimited wealth. But it wasn't enough. They wanted more. They wanted total domination. This is the tragic flaw that drives every Greek tragedy. The inability to recognize limits, to know when enough is enough, to understand that there are boundaries that should not be crossed. It's worth pausing here to recognize what Plato is doing. He is not writing history. He's writing philosophy in narrative form. The story of Atlantis' moral decline is a lesson about how civilizations fall, how virtue can be lost, and how material success can corrupt rather than fulfill. It's the same argument he makes throughout his work, that justice and virtue matter more than wealth and power, that the soul's health matters more than the body's comfort, that wisdom matters more than ambition. The fact that Atlantis started as an ideal state makes its fall more dramatic and the lesson more powerful. If even a civilization founded by a god, blessed with unlimited resources, and starting from a position of perfect virtue can fall into corruption, then no civilization is safe from this danger. Every society must constantly guard against moral decay. Eternal vigilance is required. This is the message for Athens, for Plato's students, and for anyone reading the dialogue. It's not a history lesson, it's a warning. But here's the problem. Warnings packaged as adventure stories about lost continents tend to get mistaken for the adventure story rather than the warning. We remember the exotic details about concentric rings and mysterious metals. We forget the philosophical point about virtue and corruption. And so people spent the next 2,000 years searching for the island instead of contemplating the message. In Plato's version of events, ancient Athens, this tiny city-state, somehow managed to stand alone against the vast Atlantean Empire and defeat them in battle, which is the ancient Greek equivalent of Luxembourg single-handedly defeating the United States. The Athenians were portrayed as the embodiment of virtue, courage, and proper philosophical values, because of course they were. This was written by an Athenian. After this improbable military victory, the story takes its famous catastrophic turn. The gods, specifically Zeus, decided that the Atlanteans had become too corrupt and needed to be taught a lesson. What follows is the most dramatic divine intervention since Noah needed to build a very large boat. Let's be absolutely clear about what Plato is claiming happened. According to the story, the mighty Atlantean Empire, with its 1,000,000-man army and 1,200 warships, launched an invasion of the eastern Mediterranean. They conquered Egypt. They conquered Libya. They swept through the Mediterranean islands. Every state they encountered either submitted or was crushed. They were an unstoppable force, rolling over everyone in their path. And then they made the mistake of attacking Athens. Ancient Athens at this supposed time, 9,000 years before Plato, didn't actually exist in any meaningful sense, but we're supposed to ignore that detail. In Plato's telling, Athens stood alone as the last free city. Everyone else had either been conquered or had surrendered. The Athenians were abandoned by their allies, outnumbered by impossible margins, and facing certain destruction. It's the ancient version of a Hollywood action movie setup, where the scrappy underdog faces overwhelming odds. But the Athenians, according to Plato, possessed something the Atlanteans had lost: virtue. They fought with courage, discipline, and justice on their side. They had the ideal form of government that Plato had described in other works. They embodied the philosophical principles that made a state great. And through this virtue, this moral superiority, they somehow defeated the vast Atlantean military machine. They repelled the invasion. They liberated the conquered territories. They saved the Mediterranean world from subjugation. Now, let's think about this claim for just a moment. Putting aside the fact that Athens didn't exist 9,000 years before Plato, and putting aside the fact that Atlantis almost certainly never existed either, what we have here is a story about a tiny city-state defeating a massive empire through sheer virtue and courage. It's inspiring, it's dramatic, it's also complete nonsense from a military perspective. Numbers matter in ancient warfare. Logistics matter. Technology matters. Morale and virtue are important, but they don't let you overcome 10-to-1 numerical odds. Battles aren't won by being morally superior. They're won by better tactics, better supply lines, better training, better equipment, and often just having more soldiers. But Plato isn't writing military history. He's writing philosophy. The victory of Athens over Atlantis is the victory of virtue over corruption, justice over ambition, wisdom over power. It's the argument that a state organised around proper philosophical principles can defeat a state organised around wealth and military might. It's the argument Plato made his entire career, that justice and virtue are not just morally right, they're actually practically superior. They make states stronger, not weaker. This is also convenient patriotic propaganda. Plato was an Athenian writing for an Athenian audience. Athens in his lifetime had just lost the devastating Peloponnesian War to Sparta. The city's confidence was shaken. Its empire was gone. Telling a story in which ancient Athens single-handedly saved the world from a vast empire was a way of reminding his audience of Athenian greatness and Athenian virtue. It was a call to remember who they were and what they stood for. After the Athenian victory, the gods intervened. Zeus, seeing the corruption of the Atlanteans, decided that punishment was necessary. This is standard Greek mythological justice. The gods enforce cosmic order. Hubris, the kind of excessive pride and ambition the Atlanteans displayed, must be punished. Mortals who think they can do whatever they want, who transgress the bounds of proper behaviour, who challenge the natural order, must be brought low. It's a recurring theme in Greek tragedy. Oedipus, Agamemnon, Creon, they all suffered for their hubris. The punishment Zeus chose for Atlantis was complete and utter destruction. Not just a military defeat, not just the loss of their empire, total annihilation. The island itself would be destroyed, sunk beneath the waves with all its inhabitants. It's the ultimate divine punishment, erasing them so completely that only the story remains. It's also, not coincidentally, exactly the kind of ending that makes a story memorable and impossible to verify. If Atlantis had simply been conquered and its people absorbed into other cultures, we could theoretically trace their descendants or find archaeological evidence. But if it sank completely beneath the ocean, well, that explains why there's no evidence. Very convenient. The whole narrative structure is designed to deliver a philosophical message. Virtue matters, hubris is punished, justice ultimately prevails, and Athens embodies these principles. It's a story meant to teach and inspire, not to document historical events. But because Plato told it well, with specific details and a framework that claimed historical authority, people took it literally. They focused on the lost island and the catastrophe rather than the lesson about virtue and corruption. And so the search began for something that was never meant to be found. And then, in a single day and night, Atlantis was destroyed. Plato describes violent earthquakes and floods of extraordinary proportions. The entire island, with all its magnificent temples, its impossible wealth, and its million-man army, simply sank beneath the waves and disappeared completely. Every man, woman, child, and piece of orichalcum went down with it. There were apparently no survivors, no refugees, no scattered colonies, nothing. For a civilization that supposedly controlled half the Mediterranean, they left remarkably little trace. The catastrophe was so complete and so convenient that it should have immediately registered as narrative device rather than historical fact. But humanity has never been particularly good at recognizing obvious metaphors when lost treasure is involved. The description of the catastrophe is brief, which is interesting given how much detail Plato provided about everything else. He describes earthquakes and floods occurring together, a double disaster that struck with such force that in a single day and night the island of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and vanished. The warriors of ancient Athens who had defeated the Atlanteans also perished in the same catastrophe. Swallowed by the earth, it's a clean ending that eliminates both the villain and the hero, leaving only the story. The time frame is important. A single day and night. 24 hours or less for an entire continent-sized island to sink beneath the ocean. This is not how geology works. Islands don't just vanish overnight unless we're talking about volcanic eruptions, and even then you usually get warning signs and survivors. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, one of the most violent volcanic events in modern history, destroyed most of the island but didn't make it disappear entirely. There were survivors. There was warning. The explosion was heard thousands of miles away. For a landmass the size Plato describes to sink completely beneath the ocean in 24 hours would require geological forces so extreme they would have affected the entire planet. The displacement of water alone would have created tsunamis that would have swamped every coastline. The earthquakes would have been felt globally. The atmospheric effects would have been catastrophic. We're talking about an extinction-level event, not a localized disaster. And yet somehow the rest of the world continued on normally, with no civilization except Athens reporting any problems. The completeness of the destruction is also suspicious. No ruins above water, no refugees escaping to tell the tale, no scattered colonies of Atlanteans in other lands wondering what happened to the homeland. No cultural continuity, no linguistic traces, no genetic legacy. For a civilization that supposedly had an empire stretching from Italy to Egypt, they vanished without leaving a single confirmed artifact. Every other ancient civilization, even those that fell catastrophically, left traces. The Minoans were devastated by the Thera eruption, but we found their palaces on Crete. Troy was destroyed multiple times, but we found the ruins. Even civilizations that collapsed gradually and faded from memory left pottery shards and foundation stones. But Atlantis, according to the story, left nothing. The island sank so completely that it became, in Plato's words, an impassable barrier of mud. The ocean above where Atlantis had been became shallow and marshy, impossible for ships to navigate. This detail is particularly interesting because it's demonstrably false. The Atlantic Ocean beyond Gibraltar is deep. There's no shallow mudflat out there. If there had been, ancient sailors would have encountered it and reported it. The Phoenicians and later the Carthaginians sailed regularly in the Atlantic. The Greeks themselves explored the western Mediterranean extensively. Nobody ever reported an impassable shallow region that marked the grave of a lost continent. This detail about the impassable mud actually tells us something important about when Plato wrote this story. In his time, Greek knowledge of the Atlantic was limited. They knew it was a vast ocean, and they knew it was dangerous. Sailors who ventured too far often didn't return. The idea that there might be impassable regions made sense given their limited knowledge. But it's not based on observation. It's speculation about an unexplored region. If Atlantis had been a real historical memory, Someone would have noticed by Plato's time that the Atlantic was navigable and deep, not shallow and muddy. The divine cause of the catastrophe is also telling. Zeus decided to punish the Atlanteans for their corruption and hubris. It's not presented as a natural disaster but as divine judgment. This is mythology, not history. Real disasters don't conveniently wait until right after a civilization has reached peak corruption and been defeated by its virtuous enemy. Real catastrophes are random and immoral. Earthquakes strike the virtuous and corrupt alike. Volcanic eruptions don't wait for the moral moment in a narrative arc, but in Greek thought, disasters were often interpreted as divine punishment. When bad things happened, people looked for moral explanations. The gods must be angry. Someone must have transgressed. It's a way of making sense of a chaotic world by imposing moral order on natural events. Plato was working within this framework, using the catastrophe as the final act of his moral tale. The corrupt civilization is destroyed. Justice is served. The moral of the story is clear. The problem is that this moral tale became detached from its context. People forgot it was a parable and started treating it as a historical event. They began searching for geological evidence of a sunken continent, trying to explain with plate tectonics and seismic activity what was always meant to be a metaphor. The catastrophe of Atlantis is the perfect ending to a philosophical story about hubris and divine justice. It's a terrible foundation for a historical claim about a lost civilization. But try telling that to the thousands of people who have dedicated their lives to finding the ruins beneath the waves. Now let's talk about how Plato claimed to know this story, because the provenance is, to put it mildly, questionable. He said his great-grandfather Critias heard it from his grandfather, also named Critias, who heard it from his father Dropides, who heard it from the famous Athenian lawmaker Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests during his travels. That's 4 generations of oral telephone before it even gets to Plato. The Egyptian priests supposedly translated it from records 9,000 years old, which would place Atlantis around 9500 BC, firmly in the Stone Age when humans were still figuring out agriculture and most definitely not building concentric ring cities with advanced metallurgy. The entire source chain is basically my friend's cousin's uncle's neighbour once told me, but for ancient civilizations. Let's trace this chain of transmission step by step, because each link in the chain adds layers of improbability. It starts with Egyptian priests in the city of Sais, sometime around 600 BC. The Athenian lawmaker Solon, who actually was a real historical figure, visited Egypt during his travels. This part is documented and probably true. While there, he supposedly met with priests who had access to ancient records. Egypt did have a long historical memory and did keep records. This is plausible so far. These priests, according to the story, were amused by Greek ignorance of ancient history. They told Solon that the Greeks were essentially children, knowing nothing of the deep past. To demonstrate their superior knowledge, they shared a story from their records about events that had occurred 9,000 years earlier. 9,000 years before, Solon would be roughly 9500 BC. To put that in perspective, this is before the invention of writing, before the rise of the first cities, before the development of complex agriculture. It's the Neolithic period, when humans were just beginning to transition from hunter-gatherer lifestyles to settled farming communities. The idea that Egyptian priests had written records from this period is absurd. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing was invented around 3200 BC. The oldest written records from anywhere in the world date to around 3300 BC in Mesopotamia. There were no written records from 9500 BC because writing hadn't been invented yet. The priests couldn't have been reading from ancient documents because those documents couldn't have existed. Either they were making it up, or Plato's making it up, or the timeline is completely wrong. But let's say, for argument's sake, that the priest told Solon something. Maybe they shared an actual Egyptian legend or historical memory, just from a much more recent time period. Maybe in the transmission from Egyptian to Greek, 900 years became 9,000 years through a translation error or exaggeration. This kind of numerical confusion is actually common in ancient texts. So Solon hears this story and returns to Athens, presumably sometime in the late 6th century BC. Then Solon tells the story to Dropides, who was apparently a relative and friend. We have no independent record of this. We only know about it because Plato says so, a century and a half later. Dropides then tells his son Critias the Elder, who tells his grandson Critias the Younger, who is a character in Plato's dialogue, and tells the story to Socrates and other dinner guests. That's 4 generations of oral transmission within a single family. Each person heard it as a child and remembered it into old age before passing it on. Anyone who's played the game telephone knows what happens to information passed through even a few people. Details change, elements are added or dropped, dramatic parts get emphasized, boring parts get forgotten, and that's over minutes. We're talking about information passed through 4 generations over roughly a century and a half, remembered from childhood stories by elderly men recounting what they heard decades earlier. The odds that the story remained accurate are essentially 0, and that's assuming everyone in the chain was honestly trying to pass on what they heard. It's entirely possible that someone along the way embellished the tale, added details to make it more interesting, or merged it with other stories. Ancient oral tradition is flexible. Stories grow in the telling. A minor story about a war or a disaster can become an epic over generations. Details get added to fill gaps. Supernatural elements get included to make the story more memorable or meaningful. By the time it reaches Plato, we're getting what Critias the Younger remembers hearing as a child from his grandfather about what his grandfather heard from his father, about what his father heard from Solon, about what Solon heard from Egyptian priests about what they claimed was in 9,000-year-old records that couldn't possibly have existed. Each link in that chain is an opportunity for error, embellishment, misunderstanding, or invention. Plato himself might have added details or changed elements to suit his philosophical purposes. He's writing a dialogue, not a historical document. He's creating a compelling narrative to illustrate philosophical points. If he needs Atlantis to have specific features to make his argument work, he's free to include them. The entire source chain is provided not as rigorous historical documentation, but as a narrative framing device. It's a way of saying, this is an old story, not this is verified fact. The comparison to actual historical methods is stark. When Herodotus wrote his histories, he interviewed eyewitnesses when possible, visited the places he described, consulted multiple sources, and explicitly noted when he was skeptical or when accounts differed. Thucydides was even more rigorous, insisting on eyewitness testimony and careful documentation. Plato does none of this. He provides a single source chain, all oral, spanning over a century, with no corroboration and no verification. It's the weakest possible form of historical evidence. But because the story is so compelling and detailed, people treated it as reliable. They wanted it to be true, so they accepted the source chain despite its obvious weakness. And so the hunt for Atlantis began, built on a foundation of multi-generational telephone. Here's something interesting. After Plato wrote about Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, leaving the latter unfinished mid-sentence like a streaming service cancelling a show on a cliffhanger, the ancient world was curiously quiet about this supposedly massive historical event. Aristotle, Plato's own student, apparently believed his teacher had simply invented it as a literary device. Other ancient historians, who were quite happy to record every mythological tale and legendary war they could find, didn't mention Atlantis at all. For something that supposedly involved the conquest of half the Mediterranean and the most dramatic natural disaster in human history, the silence from contemporary sources is deafening. It's almost as if everyone who actually lived closer to the alleged events understood that it was obviously a philosophical parable and not a history lesson. Let's start with Aristotle, because his response is telling. Aristotle studied under Plato for nearly 20 years. He knew his teacher's work intimately. He wrote extensively about philosophy, politics, natural science, and history. He commented on many of Plato's ideas, sometimes agreeing, often disagreeing. And when it came to Atlantis, later sources tell us that Aristotle apparently said that the man who dreamed it up also made it disappear. In other words, Plato invented it for his purposes and then destroyed it for those same purposes. Aristotle, who lived closest to Plato in time and knowledge, who would have had access to any evidence or sources Plato used, didn't believe Atlantis was real. This is significant because Aristotle was not someone who automatically dismissed unusual claims. He wrote about strange animals in distant lands, some of which turned out to be real. He discussed unusual natural phenomena. He was curious about the world and willing to investigate claims that seemed odd. But he apparently saw Atlantis for what it was, a literary creation used to make a philosophical point. If Plato's own student, with access to Plato himself, and to any sources Plato might have consulted, didn't believe it, that should tell us something. Other ancient historians were similarly silent. Herodotus, who wrote in the generation before Plato, and who loved collecting stories about distant lands and ancient events, never mentioned Atlantis. He wrote extensively about Egypt, and claimed to have interviewed Egyptian priests himself. If they were telling Greeks about a massive war with a lost continent, Herodotus, who would have absolutely loved that story, somehow missed it. Thucydides, writing around the same time as Plato, made no mention of it. Xenophon, another student of Socrates, didn't reference it. In fact, for the next several centuries after Plato, Atlantis barely appears in Greek and Roman literature at all. When it does come up, it's usually in the context of discussing Plato's works, not as an independent historical tradition. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around the time of Christ, mentioned Atlantis but only to say that Plato invented it, and then destroyed it to get out of his story. Pliny the Elder, who loved collecting unusual facts, didn't include Atlantis in his natural history, which covered geography, peoples and natural phenomena from all over the known world. This silence is remarkable. Ancient historians and geographers were fascinated by distant lands, lost civilizations and catastrophic events. They recorded legends, myths, and historical memories from dozens of cultures. If Atlantis had been a real historical memory preserved in Egyptian records, we would expect to see references to it in other sources. Egyptian historical texts should mention it. Other Mediterranean cultures affected by Atlantean conquest should have their own versions of the story. There should be linguistic traces, place names, or folk memories in the regions they supposedly conquered. But there's nothing. No Egyptian text mentions Atlantis. No Phoenician, Carthaginian, or Etruscan source references them. The peoples who supposedly lived through Atlantean conquest left no record of it. The catastrophic sinking of a continent-sized island, which would have created tsunamis and climate effects across the Mediterranean and Atlantic, appears in no other culture's disaster memories, for an event that supposedly happened 9,000 years before Plato but affected civilizations all around the Mediterranean. The absolute lack of corroboration is damning. Compare this to actual ancient events. The Trojan War, which happened roughly 900 years before Plato, appears in the oral traditions, poetry, and historical memory of the Greeks. The Sea People's invasion, which disrupted Mediterranean civilizations in the late Bronze Age, shows up in Egyptian records, Hittite texts, and archaeological evidence. The volcanic eruption of Thera appears in geological records and possibly in cultural memories. Real events leave traces in multiple sources, multiple cultures, and in physical evidence. Atlantis appears in exactly one source: Plato's philosophical dialogues, and even there, he never finished the story. The dialogue Critias breaks off mid-sentence, never completed. Some scholars think Plato lost interest. Others suggest he died before finishing it. Either way, even the original, author didn't see fit to complete his tale of Atlantis. If this was really important historical information that Plato was preserving for posterity, you'd think he'd have finished writing it down. The people closest to the alleged events, with the best access to sources and traditions, didn't believe Atlantis was real. The historians most interested in exactly this kind of material didn't record it. The cultures supposedly affected by it have no memory of it. The only explanation that makes sense is that Atlantis was recognized by ancient readers for what it was: a philosophical thought experiment, a literary device, a parable about virtue and corruption dressed up as ancient history to make it more compelling. Everyone understood this. They just didn't care enough to write down their skepticism because it was obvious. Only modern readers, separated by 2,000 years and desperately wanting to believe in lost advanced civilizations, have mistaken the metaphor for history. The silence of the ancient world is not mysterious. It's them declining to comment on something they recognized as fiction. For roughly 1,000 years after Plato's death, almost nobody cared about Atlantis. Medieval scholars had the texts, they could read Greek, they knew the story existed, and they collectively shrugged and moved on to worry about things like the end of the world and whether angels could dance on pinheads. There were no medieval expeditions searching for the lost continent. No knights were dispatched to find it. The Islamic scholars who preserved so much Greek knowledge didn't seem particularly interested. It simply wasn't a thing that captured the imagination of serious thinkers, because serious thinkers recognized it for what it was: a made-up place in a philosophical dialogue. The obsession with Atlantis as a real lost civilization is actually a surprisingly modern phenomenon. Think about the medieval intellectual landscape for a moment. These were people absolutely obsessed with ancient texts and ancient knowledge. After the fall of Rome, classical learning was preserved in monasteries and Islamic libraries. Scholars copied Greek and Roman manuscripts by hand, preserving philosophy, science, and literature. They studied Plato extensively. The Republic was known and discussed. Timaeus was particularly important to medieval Christian philosophy because it described the creation of the world in terms that could be harmonized with Genesis. They read these dialogues carefully, analysed them, commented on them, and incorporated them into their worldview. And yet, in all of this extensive medieval scholarship, Atlantis barely gets a mention. When Timaeus was discussed, scholars focused on its cosmology and metaphysics, not on the Atlantis story in the introduction. The tale of a lost continent wasn't considered theologically important or philosophically significant. It was recognized as a narrative frame, a story Plato told to introduce his real points about the nature of the universe and the soul. Medieval readers were perfectly capable of distinguishing between the philosophical content and the literary packaging. Islamic scholars, who preserved and translated vast amounts of Greek knowledge during the medieval period, also showed little interest in Atlantis. They translated Plato's works, studied his philosophy, and wrote extensive commentaries. They were fascinated by Greek science, mathematics, and medicine. They preserved texts that would have been lost in Christian Europe, but Atlantis didn't capture their imagination either. It wasn't treated as a historical mystery to be solved or a lost civilization to be found. It was understood as what it was, a story within a philosophical text. The few times Atlantis appears in medieval writing, it's almost always in the context of discussing Plato's works, not as an independent historical claim. Medieval encyclopedias might mention it when covering Greek philosophy, listing it alongside other Platonic ideas, but it's filed under philosophy or mythology, not history or geography. The distinction was clear to medieval readers in a way that seems to have become confused in the modern era. Part of this medieval indifference probably stemmed from the fact that medieval Christians had their own flood story. The biblical flood of Noah was the catastrophic divine judgment they believed in. It was recorded in Scripture, which was considered far more authoritative than any Greek philosopher. If God had destroyed a corrupt civilization with a flood, it was the one described in Genesis, not some island of pagan gods mentioned by Plato. There was no theological reason to take Atlantis seriously, and without theological significance, it simply wasn't a priority for medieval thinkers. The medieval period also had its own legendary islands and distant lands to be interested in. There was the legend of St. Brendan's Isle, supposedly discovered by an Irish monk, sailing the Atlantic. There was Prester John's Kingdom, a mythical Christian empire somewhere in the east. There was the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, which mapmakers sometimes placed as an actual location. These were the mysterious places that captured medieval imagination, because they fit into Christian cosmology and had theological importance. Atlantis, associated with pagan Greek gods and not mentioned in the Bible, simply couldn't compete. It's also worth noting that the medieval period didn't have the same obsession with ancient advanced civilizations that modern culture does. Medieval people generally believed their own time represented the apex of civilization, or at least was moving toward the ultimate fulfillment at the end of history with Christ's return. The idea of a lost golden age with superior technology wasn't as psychologically appealing. They had their theological golden age in the Garden of Eden before the fall, and their future golden age in the promised Kingdom of Heaven. They didn't need Atlantis. The contrast with the modern obsession is striking. Today, Atlantis is everywhere. In books, documentaries, films, and television shows. Expeditions search for it regularly. Every underwater ruin gets proposed as a possible location. But for 1,000 years of medieval scholarship, when Greek texts were studied more intensively than ever before or since, when classical knowledge was preserved and analysed by the best minds of the age, Atlantis was essentially ignored. This tells us something important. The people closest to the classical tradition, who read Greek fluently and studied Plato deeply, didn't think Atlantis was real or particularly important. The obsession with finding it is a modern invention, not an ancient tradition. Medieval scholars shrugged and moved on. Perhaps we should have followed their example. Everything changed in the 16th century when European explorers started sailing across the Atlantic and discovering that there were in fact massive continents beyond the Pillars of Hercules that the ancient Greeks hadn't known about. Suddenly, Plato's geography didn't seem quite so impossible. Writers and philosophers began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, he had been describing real places. Some suggested that the Americas themselves were the remnants of Atlantis, or that the indigenous peoples were descendants of Atlantean refugees. It was the beginning of a very long and very confident tradition of Europeans deciding that any impressive ancient civilization must have been connected to or influenced by Europeans or their mythological ancestors, because apparently nobody else was capable of building pyramids or understanding astronomy without help. The age of exploration fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about the world and about ancient texts. Columbus sailed to the Americas in 1492. Within a few decades, Europeans realized they had encountered entire continents that ancient geography hadn't described. The classical understanding of the world was demonstrably incomplete. If the ancients didn't know about the Americas, maybe there were other things they knew about that modern Europeans had forgotten. Maybe those old legends and myths contained fragments of real geographical knowledge. This created a kind of intellectual opening for reconsidering Atlantis. Plato had said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, the Americas were beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Could there be a connection? Renaissance scholars, excited by exploration and rediscovery of classical texts, began speculating. Perhaps Atlantis hadn't been a mythical island, but an early name for the Americas. Perhaps ancient sailors had reached the New World and brought back stories that were garbled over time into Plato's account. The problem, of course, is that this doesn't actually match what Plato described. He said Atlantis sank beneath the waves. The Americas manifestly did not sink. They're still there, quite visible, with millions of indigenous people living on them. But this didn't stop the speculation. Some writers suggested that Atlantis had been a landmass connecting Europe to the Americas, a kind of mid-Atlantic continent that sank, leaving only islands behind. Others proposed that parts of Atlantis survived as Caribbean islands. The theories multiplied as European exploration expanded. What's particularly revealing is how quickly these theories became entangled with colonialism and racism. European explorers encountered sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, and many others. These cultures had monumental architecture, advanced astronomy, complex political systems, and impressive art. Rather than acknowledging that indigenous peoples had developed these achievements themselves, many European writers decided there must have been outside influence. Perhaps the Americas had been colonized by Atlanteans. Perhaps the indigenous peoples were degraded descendants of a superior civilization. This thinking appears in many Renaissance and early modern texts. The Spanish chronicler Francisco López de Gomera suggested in 1553 that the Americas might be the Atlantis that Plato described. The English philosopher Francis Bacon wrote The New Atlantis in 1626, a utopian novel set in a hidden society in the Americas. While Bacon's work was fiction, it contributed to the association between the New World and Atlantean legends. The connection became embedded in European thinking about the Americas. The underlying assumption was deeply problematic and would persist for centuries. It was essentially impossible in this worldview for non-European peoples to have achieved greatness on their own. Impressive pyramids in Egypt or Mexico must share a common source, probably European or Mediterranean. Complex astronomy among the Maya must have been learned from someone else, not developed independently. This is the same logic that would later produce theories about aliens building the pyramids, a fundamental inability to credit ancient non-European peoples with the intelligence and capability to create sophisticated civilizations. The Renaissance revival of interest in Atlantis was thus intimately connected with European colonial expansion and the ideology that justified it. Europeans were rediscovering and cataloguing the world, and in the process they were reinterpreting ancient texts to fit their new geographical knowledge and their assumptions about racial and cultural superiority. Atlantis became a useful myth for this project. It provided a classical, respectable pedigree for the idea that the Americas had once been connected to European civilization. This is also when Atlantis began its transformation from philosophical parable to historical mystery. Renaissance readers were less interested in Plato's moral arguments about virtue and corruption than in the exotic detail about a lost civilization. They focused on the geography, the architecture, the wealth, and the catastrophe. They extracted Atlantis from its philosophical context and treated it as a standalone historical claim. The story became detached from its meaning. It's ironic, really. Medieval scholars who studied Plato intensively understood that Atlantis was a literary device. Renaissance scholars, flush with the excitement of exploration and discovery, decided it must be real. The further removed from classical learning we became, the more literal we became about Atlantis. The age of exploration should have made us more skeptical about ancient geographical claims, recognizing how much the ancients didn't know. Instead, it made us more credulous, searching for ways to validate ancient stories by mapping them onto new discoveries. And so the modern hunt for Atlantis began, born from colonialism, fueled by geographical speculation, and fundamentally misunderstanding what Plato had been trying to say. The man who truly transformed Atlantis from an obscure philosophical footnote into a global obsession was a 19th century American politician named Ignatius Donnelly. In 1882, he published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and it became a massive bestseller. Donnelly argued with great confidence and absolutely no archaeological evidence that Atlantis had been a real advanced civilization, that it was the origin point for all human culture, and that its refugees had founded the great ancient civilizations of Egypt, Mexico, Peru, and pretty much everywhere else that had impressive ruins. His evidence was mostly that different cultures built pyramids and had flood myths, which is roughly as convincing as arguing that all animals must be related because they all have legs. But it didn't matter. The book struck a nerve with the Victorian imagination. Ignatius Donnelly was a fascinating character, which is important because his personality shaped how Atlantis would be understood for the next century. He was a Minnesota politician, a lieutenant governor and congressman who turned to writing after his political career stalled. He was intelligent, well-read, and absolutely convinced of his own theories, even when experts disagreed with him. He had previously written a book arguing that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays, and he would later write a book claiming that civilization was nearly destroyed by a comet in the 13th century BC. He was, in modern terms, a prolific pseudo-historian with a gift for making complex claims sound convincing to general audiences. Atlantis, the antediluvian world, presented itself as serious scholarship. It had footnotes, references to ancient texts, and a confident academic tone. Donnelly marshalled an impressive array of evidence, or what he claimed was evidence, for Atlantis' existence. He pointed out similarities between Old World and New World civilizations. Both built pyramids, both had flood myths, both used similar agricultural techniques, both had legends of culture heroes who taught them civilization. To Donnelly, these similarities could only be explained by a common source, Atlantis, which had sent colonists and refugees to both hemispheres after its destruction. The problem is that these similarities are either superficial or easily explained by other means. Pyramids are a stable architectural form that multiple cultures developed independently, because if you're stacking stones and want a tall structure, a pyramid shape prevents it from falling over. It's basic engineering, not evidence of cultural contact. Flood myths appear in many cultures because floods are common disasters that affect agricultural societies living near rivers and coasts. Devastating floods are memorable and get incorporated into cultural mythology. You don't need a literal global flood or Atlantean refugees to explain why. Multiple cultures have flood stories. But Donnelly's argument sounded convincing to readers who lacked archaeological or anthropological training. He was writing at a time when these fields were still relatively new, when the public understanding of human prehistory was limited, and when the idea of cultural diffusion from a single source seemed plausible. Victorian society was also deeply invested in ideas of progress and civilization, spreading from superior cultures to inferior ones. Donnelly's Atlantis fit perfectly into this worldview, an advanced white civilization that had brought culture to the savage races before being destroyed. The book's success was extraordinary. It went through dozens of editions and was translated into multiple languages. It inspired countless imitators and sparked a wave of Atlantis speculation that continues today. Donnelly gave Atlantis a new life in popular culture. He transformed it from an obscure reference in Plato into a historical mystery that demanded investigation. He created what would become an entire genre, Atlantology, the study of a place that doesn't exist using methods that aren't scientific. What makes Donnelly's influence so significant is that he established patterns of thinking about Atlantis that persist to this day. He popularized the idea that Atlantis was the mother civilization of all human culture, the source from which everything else flowed. He established the practice of finding superficial similarities between cultures and claiming they prove Atlantean influence. He created the template for ignoring expert opinion and archaeological evidence in favor of compelling but baseless speculation. Every modern Atlantis book, documentary, or theory is essentially following the path Donnelly laid out. It's worth noting that professional archaeologists and historians rejected Donnelly's theories almost immediately. They pointed out his errors, his misinterpretations of evidence, and his logical fallacies. But their criticism didn't matter to his popular audience. The experts were seen as close-minded or protecting their own turf. Donnelly positioned himself as a courageous truth-teller, challenging the establishment, a framing that proved remarkably effective then and remains popular now among pseudo-historians. The late 19th century was hungry for these kinds of grand theories about human origins and lost civilizations. It was an age of exploration, of archaeological discoveries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, of growing awareness of human prehistory. People wanted explanations for the rise of civilization, and Donnelly gave them a simple, exciting one. Atlantis did it. It was more appealing than the complex, messy reality of human cultures developing independently over thousands of years through trial and error. Donnelly's Atlantis was also conveniently located to be unfindable. He placed it in the mid-Atlantic, where the ocean is deep and exploration was impossible with 19th century technology. This meant his theory couldn't be disproven, at least not immediately. By the time we developed the technology to map the ocean floor and confirm that there's no sunken continent there, Atlantis believers had simply moved their proposed location or added new layers of explanation for why we haven't found it yet. The birth of Atlantology in the 1880s marked a turning point. Atlantis became a cultural phenomenon, not just a philosophical text. It entered the realm of popular belief, alternative history, and eventually pseudoscience. Donnelly bears much of the responsibility for this transformation. He took Plato's parable about hubris and turned it into the greatest archaeological mystery of all time. The fact that it was never a mystery to begin with, that experts knew it was fiction, didn't matter. The public had spoken. Atlantis was real, and the search was on. Just when you thought things couldn't get stranger, the Theosophists arrived on the scene. This was a spiritual movement founded in the late 1800s, and they absolutely loved Atlantis. Their leader, Helena Blavatsky, claimed to have accessed ancient mystical knowledge through astral projection or psychic powers or something equally verifiable. She declared that Atlantis had been inhabited by the fourth root race of humanity, who were advanced spiritual beings but unfortunately still mortal enough to drown. She provided incredibly detailed descriptions of Atlantean society, technology, and spiritual practices, all of which she channeled from the Akashic records, a cosmic library that exists on another plane of reality and conveniently cannot be fact-checked. The Theosophists transformed Atlantis from a possibly real ancient civilization into a full-blown mystical fantasy. Helena Petrovna Blavatsky was one of the most influential and controversial figures of the late 19th century. She was a Russian émigré who founded the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875, along with Henry Steele Olcott and William Quan Judge. Theosophy was a syncretic spiritual movement that blended elements of Buddhism, Hinduism, Western esotericism, and Blavatsky's own rather creative interpretations of ancient wisdom. The movement claimed to possess secret knowledge about the true nature of reality, human spiritual evolution, and the hidden history of the world. Blavatsky's magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, contained extensive information about Atlantis that supposedly came from ancient Tibetan manuscripts and mystical sources. According to her elaborate cosmology, humanity had evolved through a series of root races, each more spiritually and physically advanced than the last. The fourth root race were the Atlanteans, giant beings who lived millions of years ago and possessed both advanced technology and powerful psychic abilities. They were described as having built a great civilization with flying machines, energy, weapons, and mastery over natural forces. The level of detail Blavatsky provided is remarkable, given that she had absolutely no historical evidence for any of it. She described the appearance of Atlanteans, their social structure, their spiritual practices, and their eventual downfall through misuse of their powers. She claimed they had harnessed a mysterious force called vril, an idea she borrowed from a popular science fiction novel of the time. They could control gravity, manipulate matter with thought, and communicate telepathically. It was science fiction dressed up as ancient history and presented as spiritual truth. According to theosophical teaching, the Atlanteans fell because they became corrupt and began using their powers for selfish purposes, particularly black magic and the exploitation of the less evolved races. This sounds suspiciously like Plato's account, because it essentially is Plato's account, but inflated with pseudoscientific terminology and mystical embellishments. The continent was destroyed in a series of cataclysms, the last occurring around 9600 BC, conveniently close to Plato's timeline. The few spiritually pure Atlanteans escaped and became the teachers of later civilizations, explaining why ancient cultures around the world had similar wisdom traditions. Blavatsky claimed to have learned all of this through access to the Akashic records, a kind of cosmic database that supposedly contains the complete history of every thought, word, and action that has ever occurred in the universe. This information exists on a spiritual plane and can only be accessed through psychic abilities or mystical training. It's a concept borrowed and adapted from Hindu and Buddhist ideas about universal consciousness, but transformed into a convenient explanation for how Blavatsky knew things that no historical records mentioned. If someone asked for evidence, she could simply say it was in the Akashic records, which by definition cannot be verified by normal means. The theosophical version of Atlantis influenced generations of occultists, spiritualists, and alternative historians. Other theosophists expanded on Blavatsky's foundation. Rudolf Steiner, who later founded anthroposophy after breaking with the Theosophical Society, provided even more detailed descriptions of Atlantean civilization based on his own claimed access to spiritual knowledge. He described their architecture, their education system, their relationship with nature, all presented with the authority of someone who had personally witnessed it through clairvoyant vision. The appeal of this mystical Atlantis is obvious. It combines the excitement of a lost civilization with the promise of ancient wisdom and spiritual powers. It suggests that humanity once possessed abilities and knowledge that we've since lost, but which we might recover through spiritual development. It flatters the believer by suggesting they have access to secret truth that mainstream science and history deny or suppress. It's psychologically satisfying in a way that mundane historical reality isn't. The theosophical movement also introduced a troubling racial element to Atlantis speculation. Blavatsky's root races were explicitly hierarchical, with some races more spiritually evolved than others. Her cosmology placed white Europeans as the current fifth root race, the most advanced, with other races representing earlier, less evolved stages of human development. This racist pseudoscience was unfortunately common in the late 19th century, but Theosophy gave it a veneer of mystical authority and ancient wisdom. The idea that Atlantis was inhabited by an advanced white race that brought civilization to lesser peoples fit neatly into colonial and racist ideologies of the time. Modern Theosophy has largely moved away from these more explicitly racist elements, but the influence of Theosophical Atlantology remains significant. Many contemporary alternative historians, whether they know it or not, are working within a framework established by Blavatsky and her followers. The idea that Atlantis possessed advanced technology, the notion that its survivors taught ancient cultures, the claim that its secrets can be accessed through mystical means. These all trace back to theosophical sources, not to Plato or any historical evidence. The Theosophists took Atlantis completely out of the realm of history or even pseudo-history, and placed it firmly in the domain of mysticism and spiritual fantasy. They transformed it from a place that might theoretically be found through archaeology into a spiritual reality that exists primarily on other planes of existence. This made Atlantis unfalsifiable in a new way. If you can't find physical evidence, that's because the real truth is spiritual, not material. It's a perfect trap of circular reasoning that makes Atlantis invulnerable to disproof while providing believers with endless opportunities for creative speculation. In the 20th century, American mystic Edgar Cayce took the Atlantis mythology to even greater heights of creative invention. Known as the Sleeping Prophet, Cayce would enter trance states and deliver readings on topics ranging from health to past lives. He claimed that Atlantis had possessed technology far beyond our own, including lasers, aircraft, and some sort of mysterious power crystals. He said that Atlantis had been destroyed in 3 separate catastrophes over thousands of years, and that it would rise again in 1968 or 69 near Bimini in the Bahamas. When that didn't happen, believers simply recalculated. Cayce gave hundreds of readings about Atlantis, and thousands of people apparently had past lives there, which statistically raises questions about what everyone else in the ancient world was doing while all these souls were busy being Atlantean. Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 in Kentucky and became one of America's most famous psychics and healers. His method was unusual. He would lie down, enter a self-induced trance state, and while unconscious would answer questions posed to him. During these readings, he would allegedly access universal knowledge and could provide information on any topic, though he specialized in medical diagnosis and past life readings. His followers called him the Sleeping Prophet. Skeptics noted that his accuracy rate was considerably less than 100%. Cayce began giving readings about Atlantis in the 1920s, and over the next 2 decades delivered over 700 readings that mentioned the lost continent. According to these trance communications, Atlantis had existed for over 200,000 years, much longer than Plato's timeline. It went through several distinct periods of development, reaching its peak around 50,000 to 15,000 BC. During this golden age, the Atlanteans possessed technology that would make modern civilization look primitive by comparison. The Atlantean technology Cayce described reads like a science fiction novel. They had aircraft powered by some form of anti-gravity technology. They possessed powerful laser-like devices called terrible crystals or firestones that could be used both for beneficial purposes like powering their civilization and for destructive purposes like weapons. These crystals could focus and amplify energy from the sun and stars. The Atlanteans used them for everything from lighting their cities to powering their flying machines to communicating over long distances. When misused, these same crystals caused earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that would eventually destroy the continent. According to Casey, Atlantis wasn't destroyed in a single catastrophic event as Plato described, but in 3 major disasters spread over thousands of years. The first occurred around 50,000 BC and broke up the continent into several large islands. The second happened around 28,000 BC and caused further fragmentation. The final destruction occurred around 10,500 BC, which is at least closer to Plato's timeline. This last cataclysm sank the remaining islands beneath the waves, leaving only a few scattered remnants. The survivors fled to Egypt, Central America, and other locations, bringing their knowledge with them and founding the great civilizations of antiquity. Casey also provided a fascinating explanation for why so many of his clients seem to have past lives in Atlantis. According to his readings, many Atlantean souls were reincarnating in the 20th century, drawn back to Earth at a time when humanity was approaching a similar level of technological development and facing similar moral choices about how to use that technology. This conveniently explained why dozens of people getting readings from Casey discovered they had been Atlantean priests, priestesses, technicians, or rulers. It wasn't that everyone was inventing glamorous past lives. It was that Atlantean souls were specifically reincarnating now. The most famous and testable of Casey's predictions was that Atlantis would begin to rise again in 1968 or 1969 near Bimini in the Bahamas. This was a specific, falsifiable claim, which is unusual in the world of mystical prophecy. His followers eagerly awaited proof that would finally vindicate the sleeping prophet and prove the existence of Atlantis. When 1968 arrived, Casey's followers were watching the waters near Bimini very carefully. And then something remarkable happened. In September 1968, divers discovered what appeared to be a structured stone formation underwater near North Bimini. It consisted of large rectangular limestone blocks arranged in what looked like a road or wall. News spread quickly through Casey's following. This was it. Atlantis was rising exactly as predicted. The Bimini Road, as it became known, was held up as proof that Casey had been right all along. Books were written, expeditions were launched. The discovery was proclaimed as one of the most important archaeological finds of the century. There was just one problem. Geologists who examined the formation determined it was almost certainly natural. The rectangular shapes were the result of natural fracturing patterns common in beach rock formations. The parallel lines were produced by geological processes, not human construction. The regular appearance that suggested artificial construction was actually the result of very regular natural forces creating very regular patterns. It happens. Nature can produce surprisingly geometric shapes under the right conditions. The Bimini Road was not a road, not Atlantean, and not rising from the depths. It was a natural rock formation that happened to look man-made if you wanted it to look man-made. This did nothing to dissuade true believers. They accused geologists of bias, of not wanting to acknowledge the evidence, of being part of an establishment conspiracy to suppress the truth about Atlantis. They pointed to the precise timing of the discovery matching Casey's prediction. They hired their own experts who were willing to say the formation could be artificial. They emphasized the aspects of the formation that seemed too regular to be natural, while ignoring the many aspects that clearly were natural. The Bimini Road became and remains a pilgrimage site for Atlantis believers despite the overwhelming geological consensus that it's not artificial. Casey's influence on modern Atlantis belief cannot be overstated. He made Atlantis contemporary and relevant by connecting it to reincarnation and modern souls. He updated the civilization with advanced technology that spoke to 20th century imagination, moving beyond Plato's Bronze Age city to something that could rival or exceed modern capabilities. He made specific predictions that gave believers hope they would see proof in their lifetimes, and he framed the search for Atlantis as a spiritual quest, not just an archaeological one. You weren't just looking for lost cities, you were recovering lost wisdom and lost parts of yourself. The fact that his specific prediction about Atlantis rising in 1968 didn't actually come true has not diminished his influence among believers. Failed prophecies rarely damage a prophet's reputation among true followers. They simply provide opportunities for reinterpretation. Perhaps Casey meant it would begin to be discovered in 1968, and the Bimini Road counts even if it's natural. Perhaps he meant it spiritually rather than literally. Perhaps the timeline was off by a bit, but the essential truth remains. The ability of believers to reframe failed predictions as successes or near successes is remarkable. And so, Edgar Casey remains the sleeping prophet whose visions of Atlantis continue to inspire seekers despite the distinct lack of rising continents or laser crystals. In 1968, right on schedule for Edgar Casey's prediction, divers discovered an underwater rock formation near Bimini that looked vaguely like a road or wall. Atlantis enthusiasts lost their minds. This was it, the proof they'd been waiting for. Expeditions were funded, books were written, television specials were produced. The problem is that geologists examined the formation and determined it was almost certainly natural, a type of beach rock formation that occurs in shallow tropical waters. The rectangular shapes were the result of natural fracturing patterns, not human construction. This did absolutely nothing to dissuade true believers who simply accused geologists of being part of the cover-up. It's a pattern that would repeat itself whenever actual science examined supposed Atlantis evidence. The discovery of the Bimini Road on September 2nd, 1968 seemed too perfect to be coincidence. Edgar Casey had predicted decades earlier that Atlantis would begin to rise near Bimini in 68 or 69, and here was a massive underwater formation that looked for all the world like a man-made structure, discovered at exactly the right time in exactly the right place. The formation consisted of large rectangular limestone blocks arranged in a linear pattern stretching for approximately half a mile. The blocks appeared to be carefully placed, with relatively uniform spacing between them. From above, particularly in photographs, it looked remarkably like an ancient road or harbour wall. The man who discovered it, Joseph Manson Valentine, was an archaeologist and Casey enthusiast who had been searching the waters around Bimini specifically because of the prophecy. He was flying over the area in a light aircraft when he spotted the formation through the clear, shallow water. He immediately recognized it as potentially significant and organized diving expeditions to investigate further. What he found seemed to confirm his hopes. The stones were large, some weighing several tons. They appeared too regularly arranged to be natural. Some stones seemed to have tool marks. The discovery made headlines in the alternative archaeology community and beyond. David Zink, another researcher, conducted extensive investigations of the Bimini Road in the 1970s. He photographed it, measured it, took samples, and wrote a book claiming it was artificial. He reported finding what appeared to be a tongue and groove joint in one section, which would be clear evidence of human construction. He described stones that seemed to have been shaped or dressed. He found what he believed were anchor stones and other artifacts nearby. Each piece of evidence was presented as further confirmation that this was indeed an Atlantean structure. Then the actual geologists arrived and started doing actual geology. What they found was considerably less exciting, but considerably more convincing. The Bimini Road is a formation of beach rock, which is a type of sedimentary rock that forms in tropical and subtropical coastal areas. Beach rock forms when beach sediments are cemented together by calcium carbonate precipitation. This process is well understood and produces very specific characteristics, and the Bimini Road has all of them. The rectangular shapes that seem too regular to be natural are actually the result of natural fracturing patterns. When beach rock forms in layers and is then subjected to stress from tidal action, temperature changes and geological movement, it fractures along predictable lines. These fractures tend to be perpendicular to each other, creating rectangular blocks. This is basic geology. The same process creates similar formations in other locations around the world. The Devil's Causeway in Ireland, for instance, is a famous example of natural columnar basalt that looks artificial but isn't. Nature is perfectly capable of producing geometric patterns. The size and arrangement of the blocks also fit perfectly with beach rock formation. The road follows the contour line of an ancient beach, exactly where you would expect beach rock to form. The depth is consistent with the sea level at the time the beach rock would have formed several thousand years ago when the sea level was lower. The stones aren't actually carefully placed. They're in the exact position where they formed, which happens to be linear because they formed along a beach. Ancient peoples building a road or wall would have had no reason to follow that particular contour line at that particular depth. Core samples taken from the blocks show that they're not made of cut and placed stone but of naturally cemented beach sediment. They contain shells and sand and other materials you'd expect to find in beach rock, not in quarried and shaped building stones. The apparent tool marks that early researchers reported turned out to be natural, weathering patterns, biological boring by marine organisms, or modern damage from curious divers. The tongue and groove joint that David Zink reported as clear evidence of human construction. Other geologists who examined the same area found no such feature. It was either misidentified or had been a trick of lighting and perspective. But here's where things get sociologically interesting. When mainstream geologists published their findings that the Bimini Road was natural, the Atlantis community didn't accept the verdict. Instead, they attacked the geologists' motives and qualifications. They accused them of bias, of refusing to consider evidence that challenged their worldview, of being beholden to academic dogma. They pointed out accurately that some geologists had dismissed the formation without even personally examining it, relying on photographs and descriptions. This criticism was valid. But when geologists who were more careful did personally examine the formation and still concluded it was natural, their conclusions were also rejected. This created an unfalsifiable situation. Any expert who said the Bimini Road was natural was dismissed as biased or incompetent. Any researcher, regardless of qualifications, who said it was artificial was embraced as courageous and open-minded. The believers had created a framework where agreement proved you were right, and disagreement proved the other person was wrong or corrupted. Evidence didn't matter. The conclusion was predetermined. The Bimini Road remains a site of pilgrimage for Atlantis believers. Diving tours go there regularly. Books continue to be written claiming it's artificial. Documentaries film it as a mysterious, unexplained structure. The fact that it has been explained, repeatedly, by multiple geologists using standard geological principles doesn't matter to the people who want it to be Atlantean. The desire for Atlantis to be real is stronger than the geological evidence that this particular formation is natural. What the Bimini Road controversy demonstrates is a broader pattern in pseudo-archaeology. When supposed evidence for extraordinary claims is examined carefully by experts and found wanting, believers don't accept the expert verdict. They reject expertise itself. They create a parallel world where alternative researchers with alternative theories are taken seriously while mainstream science is dismissed as closed-minded. This allows belief systems to persist indefinitely regardless of evidence. If evidence contradicts your belief, you simply question the evidence or those examining it. The Bimini Road is natural, but that won't stop people from diving there, hoping to touch a piece of Atlantis that was never Atlantean at all. Some Atlantis enthusiasts looked at a map, noticed that Antarctica is a large landmass and decided that Atlantis must have been located there before it was covered in ice. Never mind that Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years, or that there's no geological evidence of a recent temperate period that would allow for an advanced civilization, or that Plato specifically said Atlantis was in the Atlantic beyond Gibraltar, which is approximately nowhere near Antarctica. These are mere details when you're committed to a theory. Proponents point to ancient maps that supposedly show Antarctica without ice, though actual scholars point out that these maps are medieval or Renaissance, full of errors, and that any resemblance to Antarctica is coincidental. But the theory persists because apparently moving an entire continent to fit your narrative is easier than admitting you might be wrong. The Antarctica theory for Atlantis is particularly fascinating because it requires ignoring almost everything Plato actually said while claiming to take him seriously. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Antarctica is not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It's not in the Atlantic Ocean in any meaningful sense. It's about as far from the Mediterranean as you can possibly get while remaining on Earth. But some Atlantis theorists aren't bothered by minor details like completely wrong locations. The theory gained prominence in the mid-20th century, particularly through the work of Charles Hapgood, a professor who developed the hypothesis of crustal displacement. Hapgood proposed that the Earth's crust could shift rapidly over the mantle, causing entire continents to move to different latitudes. According to this theory, Antarctica was once much further north, in a temperate zone where civilization could flourish, before a crustal displacement moved it to the South Pole where it froze. This would explain how an advanced civilization could have existed there and then been destroyed by climate change and ice. The problem is that crustal displacement, as Hapgood described it, doesn't actually happen and is contradicted by everything we know about plate tectonics and geology. The Earth's crust doesn't slide around as a unit on the mantle. Continents move slowly through plate tectonics, at rates measured in centimetres per year, not rapidly in catastrophic shifts. Antarctica has been at or near the South Pole for millions of years. It has been covered by ice sheets for at least 34 million years. There is no geological evidence for a recent temperate period in Antarctica when humans existed, let alone when an advanced civilization could have developed. Ice core samples from Antarctica provide a detailed climate record going back hundreds of thousands of years. At no point during human existence has Antarctica been ice-free or temperate. The ice sheets are miles thick in places. Beneath that ice is bedrock that has been frozen for millions of years. If there had been a civilization there at any point when humans existed, we would see evidence in the geological and ice core record. We don't, because there wasn't one. Proponents of the Antarctica theory often point to what they call ancient maps showing Antarctica without ice. The most famous is the Piri-Reis map from 1513, which shows a southern continent that some claim depicts Antarctica's coastline as it would appear beneath the ice. This claim was popularised by Hapgood and later by Graham Hancock and other alternative historians. The problem is that the Piri-Reis map doesn't actually show Antarctica. It shows the east coast of South America, which was recently discovered and imperfectly mapped at the time. The southern portion that some claim is Antarctica is actually a highly distorted representation of the South American coast, probably based on earlier Portuguese maps. Medieval and Renaissance cartographers didn't know Antarctica existed. They sometimes drew a large southern continent called Terra Australis, which was a theoretical landmass they believed must exist to balance the continents in the northern hemisphere. This wasn't based on observation or ancient knowledge. It was based on symmetry and classical geographical theories. When Antarctica was actually discovered in the early 19th century, it turned out to be much smaller than the imagined Terra Australis, and in a different location. The resemblance between medieval maps of Terra Australis and the actual Antarctica is purely coincidental. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we ignore all the geological and cartographic evidence and accept that Antarctica was once temperate and civilized. We still have the problem that Plato didn't describe Antarctica. He described an island in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantic is in the name. The Atlantic Ocean is on the opposite side of the planet from Antarctica. To make Plato's description fit Antarctica, you have to assume that either Plato was completely wrong about the location, or that the story was so garbled over its transmission that Antarctica became the Atlantic, which raises the question of why we should trust any other detail of the story. The Antarctica theory also requires us to believe that an advanced civilization existed there, left no archaeological trace despite having technology impressive enough to be remembered in myths, and then disappeared completely when the continent froze over, with all its refugees somehow failing to preserve any knowledge of where they came from, despite supposedly founding later civilizations. It's a theory that requires multiple impossible things to be true simultaneously while ignoring all the evidence we actually have. What makes the Antarctica theory particularly frustrating is that it exemplifies a common pattern in pseudo-archaeology, starting with a conclusion and then searching for anything that might possibly support it while ignoring everything that contradicts it. If you're determined to place Atlantis in Antarctica, you can point to the Piri Reis map and ignore the fact that it doesn't actually show Antarctica. You can cite crustal displacement and ignore the fact that it's not supported by geology. You can emphasize ancient maps of Terra Australis and ignore that they were theoretical, not observational. You can build an elaborate structure of maybe and what if, and could be, while dismissing the actually that geology and history provide. The Antarctica theory is also appealing for a particular reason. It places Atlantis somewhere so remote and inaccessible that it can't be easily investigated. The ice sheets are miles thick. Exploration is difficult and expensive, so believers can maintain that the evidence is there, buried under the ice, waiting to be discovered when technology allows. It's the same strategy as placing Atlantis in the deep Atlantic, or in an alternative dimension. If you put your lost civilization somewhere that's very difficult or impossible to check, you can maintain belief in it indefinitely. The fact remains that Antarctica has been frozen for millions of years, has no evidence of human civilization, is nowhere near where Plato said Atlantis was, and requires multiple impossible geological events to even be a candidate. But none of this has stopped books, documentaries and websites from confidently proclaiming that Antarctica is the real location of Atlantis. When you're looking for a lost continent that never existed, any continent will do, apparently, even if you have to move it through time and space to make it fit. Here's where we actually get somewhere close to interesting. Some serious archaeologists and historians have suggested that if there's any real event behind the Atlantis story, it might be the catastrophic volcanic eruption of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1600 BC. This eruption was one of the largest in human history. It destroyed the Minoan settlement on the island, triggered massive tsunamis, and may have contributed to the decline of Minoan civilization on Crete. The Minoans were an advanced Bronze Age culture with impressive palaces, sophisticated art, and extensive trade networks. If Solon really did hear about this from Egyptian priests, the story could have been garbled over centuries. The problem is that Thera is in the Aegean Sea, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It wasn't a continent, and it predated Plato by only about 1200 years, not 9,000. But at least it's an actual event. The eruption of Thera was genuinely catastrophic, on a scale that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone who witnessed it. The volcano essentially exploded, ejecting an estimated 60 cubic kilometres of rock, ash and pumice into the atmosphere. The eruption column may have reached altitudes of 25 miles or more. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean. The noise would have been audible hundreds of miles away, and most dramatically, the eruption triggered tsunamis that would have devastated coastlines throughout the region, particularly the northern coast of Crete, where the major Minoan palace sites were located. The Minoan civilization was the most advanced culture in the Aegean during the Bronze Age. They built elaborate multi-story palaces at Knossos, Baistos, Malea, and other sites on Crete. These weren't defensive fortresses, but administrative and ceremonial centres with sophisticated architecture, indoor plumbing, and extensive storage facilities. They had a writing system, advanced art, extensive trade networks reaching Egypt and the Near East, and a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Greece for centuries after their decline. They were in many ways the perfect candidates for a memory of an advanced civilization that was destroyed. The Thera eruption destroyed the Minoan settlement on that island, which was essentially an outpost of Cretan civilization. The town, now called Akrotiri, has been excavated and provides a remarkable snapshot of Minoan life, preserved under volcanic ash like Pompeii. The buildings are sophisticated with beautiful frescoes, advanced construction techniques, and evidence of a prosperous trading community. The eruption buried all of this in a matter of hours. The residents apparently had some warning, as few bodies have been found, suggesting evacuation. But the town itself was completely destroyed and remained buried for over 3,000 years. The tsunamis generated by the eruption would have struck the northern coast of Crete with devastating force. Some estimates suggest waves may have reached heights of 30 feet or more by the time they reached Crete, travelling at hundreds of miles per hour. The major Minoan palaces on the northern coast would have been in the path of these tsunamis. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of these sites were damaged or destroyed around this time, though disentangling the effects of the eruption from other factors like earthquakes or human conflict is complicated. So here's a scenario that actually makes some sense. Egyptian priests whose civilization had contact with the Minoans through trade would have known about them. They might have had records of this advanced island civilization and the catastrophe that struck them. When Solon visited Egypt centuries later, they could have shared these stories. Over the centuries of transmission, details would have been distorted. The timeline might have been exaggerated from hundreds of years ago to thousands. The location might have been confused, particularly if translation between Egyptian and Greek introduced errors. The actual island of Thera might have grown in the telling into a much larger landmass. An impressive Bronze Age civilization might have been remembered as even more advanced than it actually was. The Santorini theory has the advantage of being based on an actual event affecting an actual civilization. It doesn't require impossible geography, lost continents, or violations of geological principles. It's the kind of historical kernel that could plausibly have inspired a later legend. Many myths have historical origins that were embellished over time. The Trojan War probably had some basis in real conflicts, even if the Iliad's account is heavily mythologized. Flood myths around the world may preserve memories of real catastrophic floods. Why not Atlantis as a garbled memory of Minoan civilization and the Thera eruption? The problems with the Santorini theory are significant, though. First, Plato was quite specific about the location. He said Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Santorini is in the Aegean Sea, very much not in the Atlantic. It's in the opposite direction from the Pillars of Hercules if you're starting from the eastern Mediterranean. To make Santorini fit, you have to assume Plato or his sources got the location completely wrong, which raises questions about the reliability of other details. Second, the timeline doesn't match. Plato said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would be around 9500 BC. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BC, only about 1200 years before Plato. That's off by a factor of about 7. It's possible there was confusion or exaggeration in the timeline, but it's a huge discrepancy. If the Egyptian priests were telling Solon about an event from 1600 BC, they should have known it was only 1,000 years or so in their past, not 9,000. Egyptian chronology was sophisticated. They kept good records. A nearly 10,000-year error seems unlikely. Third, Thera wasn't a continent or even a particularly large island. It was a volcanic island in the Aegean. Making it match Plato's description of a landmass larger than Libya and Asia combined requires assuming virtually every detail of size and geography was wrong. At that point, you're not really talking about the same place at all. You're saying that literally everything Plato described about Atlantis' location, size, and age is wrong. But maybe the part about it being destroyed by a natural disaster was inspired by something real. That's a pretty thin connection. Finally, there's no evidence that the Thera eruption story specifically influenced Plato. We have no Egyptian text mentioning the eruption in context that would have reached Greek sources. We have no indication that Solon heard about it or passed along stories about it. The connection is entirely speculative, based on the coincidence that there was a real Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean that was affected by a volcanic catastrophe. That's not nothing, but it's also not proof. The Santorini theory is the most respectable of the Atlantis theories, because it's based on actual archaeology and actual history. Real scholars have proposed it in peer-reviewed contexts, unlike theories about Antarctica or underwater alien bases. But even this theory requires significant distortions of what Plato actually wrote, and lacks positive evidence that the Thera eruption specifically influenced the Atlantis story. It's plausible that Plato's account was inspired by garbled memories of real Bronze Age catastrophes, but plausible isn't the same as proven, and it still leaves us with the strong likelihood that Plato was primarily creating a philosophical parable, not recording distorted history. Some Atlantis believers point to the discovery of Troy as proof that legendary cities can be real. After all, for centuries Troy was considered purely mythological, until Heinrich Schliemann excavated it in the 1870s. If Troy was real, they argue, why not Atlantis? The problem with this logic is that the Iliad was considered a historical epic poem describing a real war by a culture that had oral traditions about that war. Atlantis appears in exactly 2 philosophical dialogues as an obvious parable about hubris. The situations are not remotely comparable. It's like arguing that because New York City exists, Gotham City must also exist somewhere because they're both cities described in stories. The existence of some legendary cities does not automatically validate all legendary cities, particularly ones that were probably never meant to be taken literally. The discovery of Troy is genuinely one of the great archaeological success stories of the 19th century, and it's worth understanding what actually happened because it's quite different from how it's often portrayed in Atlantis arguments. Troy was not considered entirely mythological before Schliemann. The ancient Greeks themselves believed it had been a real city. They knew approximately where it should be located based on geographical descriptions in Homer. The Romans believed Troy was real. Julius Caesar visited the traditional site. The Byzantine and Ottoman sources maintained that a certain location in northwestern Turkey was ancient Troy. What had happened by the 19th century was that classical scholars in Western Europe, influenced by Enlightenment rationalism, had become skeptical that the Trojan War as described by Homer was historical. They viewed it as myth or legendary poetry, not reliable history. But this wasn't the same as saying Troy the city never existed. It was more that the epic war with Achilles and Hector and divine intervention was viewed as mythological, while the question of whether there had been a real city, and perhaps some real conflict behind the myth, remained open. Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman turned archaeologist, was convinced that Troy was real and could be found. He wasn't working from no information. He had Homer's geographical descriptions. He had the traditional location that had been identified for centuries. He began excavations at Hisarlik in Turkey in 1870, and he found extensive ruins of multiple cities built on the same site over thousands of years. He initially identified the wrong layer as Homeric Troy, but later excavations determined that Troy 7a, dating to the 13th century BC, was probably the city that corresponds to the Trojan War tradition, if any real conflict lies behind it. The discovery vindicated the belief that Homer's poetry contained historical memory of a real place. But notice what it didn't do. It didn't prove that the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer described. It didn't prove that Achilles fought Hector. It didn't prove that the war was about Helen, or lasted 10 years, or ended with a wooden horse. What it proved was that there was a city in the right location, at roughly the right time, that was destroyed by violence. The archaeological Troy is much smaller and less impressive than Homer's description. The war, if there was one, was probably a minor conflict between Bronze Age kingdoms, not an epic struggle of heroes and gods. This is the key distinction that Atlantis believers miss when they invoke Troy. Troy was discovered because there was a continuous tradition placing it at a specific location, because Homer's geography was detailed enough to work with, and because there actually was a city there to find. The archaeological evidence confirmed the existence of a place, not the literal truth of everything written about it. Finding Troy tells us that some legendary cities are based on real places. It doesn't tell us that all legendary cities are real, or that poetic embellishments are historically accurate. The comparison to Atlantis falls apart immediately when you examine it. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. That's a huge area. He said it was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which would make it impossible to miss with modern satellite imaging and ocean floor mapping. We've thoroughly explored the Atlantic. We've mapped the ocean floor. There is no sunken continent there. If Atlantis existed as Plato described it, we would have found it by now, or at minimum found clear geological evidence that such a landmass existed recently and sank. We have neither. Furthermore, Troy was part of Greek cultural memory from a period when Greeks had writing, cities, and historical continuity. The Iliad and Odyssey were recited for centuries. The Greeks believed Troy was real and had a general idea of where it was. Atlantis appears in exactly 2 Platonic dialogues, is not mentioned in any other ancient source as a historical place, and was understood by Plato's contemporaries like Aristotle to be a literary invention. The cultural contexts are completely different. The Troy argument is essentially this: some legendary places turned out to be real, therefore this completely different legendary place must also be real. It's a non sequitur. It's like saying that because King Arthur might have been based on a real British leader, therefore Middle-earth must exist because Tolkien described it. The fact that some fictional or legendary accounts contain kernels of historical truth doesn't mean all such accounts do. Each case must be evaluated on its own evidence. If someone wanted to discover whether Atlantis was based on a real place, they would need to approach it the way Schliemann approached Troy. You'd need continuous historical traditions pointing to a location. You'd need geographical descriptions detailed enough to work with. You'd need to search in that location with proper archaeological methods. And if you found something, you'd need to be honest about what you found versus what the legend claimed. With Atlantis, we don't have any of this. We have Plato's vague, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is essentially nowhere in particular. We have no continuous tradition, since even ancient readers didn't believe it was real. And we have thoroughly explored the supposed area and found nothing resembling Plato's description. The Troy principle, properly understood, should actually make us more skeptical about Atlantis, not less. Troy teaches us that legendary cities that were real left evidence they had specific locations that could be identified. They had cultural memories and traditions pointing to them. They left ruins that could be excavated. Atlantis has none of these things. The absence of any evidence where evidence should exist if the place were real is itself evidence that Atlantis was never meant to be real. What Troy really demonstrates is that the ancient world had both historical memory of real places preserved in legend and purely mythological locations invented for storytelling purposes. The challenge is distinguishing between them. The way you do that is through evidence, geographical specificity, cultural continuity, archaeological remains, consistency in accounts. Troy had all of these. Atlantis has none. Using Troy to argue for Atlantis is backwards. If anything, the discovery of Troy makes the absence of any comparable evidence for Atlantis even more conspicuous. We found Troy because it was there, and there was enough information to find it. We haven't found Atlantis because it isn't there and never was. And so we've reached the end of our journey through the hidden history of Atlantis, or perhaps more accurately, the hidden absence of history. The imagined geography of a philosophical parable that somehow became the most famous lost civilization in human imagination. Think about everything we've explored tonight. We began with Plato, an Athenian philosopher in the 4th century BC, telling a story about virtue and corruption, framing it with just enough detail to make it memorable. A city of concentric rings, an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a civilization blessed with impossible wealth that fell to moral decay and was destroyed by the gods in a single catastrophic day and night. It was a lesson about hubris disguised as ancient history, a warning about what happens when societies lose their virtue and reach beyond proper limits. His own student Aristotle apparently recognized it as fiction. Ancient historians who loved collecting exotic stories ignored it. Medieval scholars who studied Plato's work extensively shrugged and moved on. But then something remarkable happened. As European explorers discovered new continents and expanded their maps, people began to wonder if perhaps those old stories contained fragments of real knowledge. If the Americas existed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, maybe Atlantis had too. The search began, not based on new evidence, but on new possibilities. Renaissance writers connected Atlantis to the New World. Colonial ideologies needed justifications, and the idea of an ancient white civilization that had brought culture to savage peoples fit perfectly. 19th century politicians like Ignatius Donnelly transformed it into a grand theory of human origins, making Atlantis the mother culture of all civilization. Mystics like Blavatsky and Edgar Cayce added layers of psychic powers, crystal technology, and reincarnated Atlantean souls. Every generation added new details, new theories, new locations, and here we are, over 2,000 years after Plato wrote his dialogues, still searching, still finding circular formations and declaring them to be Atlantis, still ignoring geologists who explain that rock formations are natural, still moving the proposed location whenever one place is thoroughly searched and found wanting. From the Atlantic to the Mediterranean to Antarctica to the Sahara Desert, from a Bronze Age culture to a crystal-powered super-civilization to a mystical realm accessed through astral projection, Atlantis has become whatever we need it to be, which is perhaps the surest sign that it was never anything at all. The story of Atlantis tells us something profound about human nature. We want to believe in lost golden ages. We want to think that somewhere, sometime, people had it figured out before throwing it all away. We want mysteries that can't quite be solved, treasures that haven't quite been found, wisdom that's been lost but might be recovered. We want to believe that mainstream experts are wrong, and that the truth is hidden, waiting for courageous seekers to discover it. Atlantis provides all of this. It's the perfect mystery, because it can never be definitively solved as long as believers are willing to reinterpret the evidence and move the goalposts. But perhaps the real wisdom is recognizing that we don't need Atlantis. The actual ancient world, the one we can study through archaeology and history, is remarkable enough. Real civilizations rose and fell. Real catastrophes destroyed cities and displaced peoples. The Minoans built sophisticated palaces and were devastated by volcanic eruption and tsunamis. The Bronze Age collapse saw interconnected civilizations throughout the Mediterranean world fall within a few decades. Real lost cities like Troy and Pompeii have been excavated, teaching us about actual human lives in the ancient world. These real stories, based on evidence rather than speculation, are more valuable than any imagined Atlantis could ever be. The obsession with Atlantis, in the end, is a distraction from understanding real history. It's a way of avoiding the complex, messy, difficult work of archaeology and historical research in favour of exciting stories about advanced ancients and lost wisdom. It credits mythological figures with achievements that real humans actually accomplished through centuries of hard work, innovation, and cultural development. It suggests that our ancestors couldn't have built impressive civilizations without help from Atlanteans or aliens or lost supercultures, which is both historically wrong and deeply disrespectful to the actual humans who created the ancient world. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let go of the search for Atlantis. Rest in the knowledge that Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, that his dialogues were arguments about virtue, not geographical surveys, that the ancient world is fascinating enough without inventing continents that never existed, that modern scholars, geologists and archaeologists are not engaged in conspiracy or cover-up, but are simply following the evidence to where it actually leads, and that sometimes the most honest answer is the simplest one. Atlantis was a story, a powerful, memorable, influential story that captured imaginations for millennia, but still just a story. There's something peaceful about accepting that, about letting go of the need for lost continents and ancient super-civilizations, about appreciating human achievement for what it actually was: difficult, gradual, hard-won progress made by real people over real time. No gods creating cities with magic, no crystal-powered aircraft, no mystical wisdom lost when continents sank. Just humans doing the remarkable things humans do. Building, learning, creating, sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, always striving. That's the real story. And it's more than enough. The search for Atlantis has taken humanity to some fascinating places, both geographically and intellectually. It's inspired exploration, speculation, and no small amount of creative fiction. But perhaps now, after 2,000 years, we can finally let Plato's parable rest. We can appreciate it for what it was, a brilliant piece of philosophical storytelling that made its point about virtue and corruption so memorably that people spent millennia trying to find the location rather than understanding the lesson. So let the concentric rings of Atlantis fade back into the realm of philosophy and metaphor where they belong. Let the mysterious continent sink back beneath the waves of literary imagination, and rest tonight knowing that the real world, with all its actual mysteries and genuine wonders, is more than sufficient. You don't need Atlantis. You never did. It was always just a story someone told to make a point, and now, having heard the full story of that story, you can let it go. Sleep well. Let your mind drift peacefully, free from the weight of impossible continents and unfindable treasures. The past is remarkable enough without inventing new parts of it. The ancients were impressive enough without crediting them with technologies they didn't have. And you, modern listener, are fortunate enough to live in an age where we actually can explore the ocean floor, map the continents, read ancient texts in their original languages, and understand geology well enough to know what's possible and what isn't. The story of Atlantis has been a long voyage through human imagination, from Plato's lecture hall in Athens to YouTube conspiracy theories in the 21st century. But every voyage must end. And this one ends here, with the truth. Atlantis was never lost because it was never found because it was never there. It was always a story about us, about our capacity for greatness and our vulnerability to corruption, told by a philosopher who wanted to teach his students something important about virtue. And perhaps that's the real treasure we found tonight. Not a sunken continent, but understanding. Not ancient wisdom, but modern clarity. The wisdom to recognize a parable when we hear one. The clarity to distinguish between compelling stories and actual history. The peace that comes from no longer needing to search for something that was never meant to be found. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the myths and realities of Atlantis. May your dreams be peaceful and your rest be deep. Until our next voyage together, I wish you a calm and gentle night. Sleep well.